It is November 14th, 2021. Welcome to Checkmate on ValorTube. ValorTube, where you can tube bigly. Hey gang, this is Checkmate here with you once again. Normally I don't roll them out this quickly and this robustly, but something caught my attention that you'll see in a few slides. And this is Understanding Libya, and this is going to be in the context of Ezekiel 38. And again, good evening. I am Checkmate. I hope that you've joined me on the Fighting Checkmates group on ValorTube, and I hope that you will take a listen to what we have in store for you. Our motto at Checkmate is opinions formed by faith and experience. Within this briefing, it's going to be largely experience and history, but our point of departure is going to be a continued faith-guided examination of Ezekiel 38 primarily, as it is biblical prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled. I believe that we are in times that were foretold many thousands of years ago. So let us take this journey together and let's begin. In my meditations and prayer in anticipation of this briefing, of course, Ezekiel 38, 39, primarily 38, I came to a conclusion that it has within the first 6 passages a terribly diplomatic feel to it. And I have read this before. Please humor me while I read it again. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and lead you out, with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company, with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops, many people are with you. To me, having practiced diplomacy, what we have here is we have an individual, and perhaps it's actually an individual being guided by a demonic principality. But we know that Gog and Magog, actual locations and personalities, we've determined that this is, in the likely case, Russia. That's the point of this discussion, as we'll get into in the next slide. What we see, however, through these 2 passages, which I would break into 2 parts, really, is that you have the leadership and its investment in the move against Israel, and then starting at verse 5, what you have is what political scientists call a coalition of the willing, what got built into it. So I would direct you to Paul Lehrer and his work, because he does brilliant exposition on the locations of these places, or pick up a copy of Josephus for yourself, because it's all in there. But what we are going to zero on in the context of Ezekiel 38 is Libya, and the many people are with you, and you will see how that's pertinent. This was the story that came out in Breitbart.com that compelled me to put this presentation together this morning. It is, the story, of course, is that Gaddafi's son, Saif Al Islam, has announced that he is running for president of Libya. Elections will be held next month. There is only one other viable contender within the Libyan body politic, if you like, who stands a chance at actually winning the leadership of the country of Libya. The major point of this briefing dovetails upon the last briefing involving the Russia angle to Ezekiel 38 and 39, is that whichever one of these gentlemen actually manages to win this, it is Russia that is the actual winner. And that is the point that I intend to drive home through this briefing, is that the United States, really does not stand in a viable position to oppose or to influence. We are in the passenger seat on this one, and it is clear that the Russians, to a lesser extent the Europeans, the Turks, who are technically European, of course, as well as perhaps surrounding countries, the Tunisians and the Egyptians, who will be the external actors that will decide this. Within Libya, however, the clear-on favorite for an external actor to be the walk-off home run in terms of foreign interests is clearly Russia. So with that, let's dive right into America's tortured history with the country of Libya. This recapitulation is going to be what they call a 30,000-foot view, and it's by no means intended to be comprehensive. The reason is that we could get lost in the history, the historiography surrounding the country of Libya. It's a fascinating place. I have friends who have been there, and I've worked on Libyan issues myself. But essentially, it has been a battlefield of empires until it was finally captured in 1511. It had changed hands a number of times through antiquity. And the first real major contact we see between the United States and what is now known as Libya is between 1801 and 1804, when there was the Barbary privateers. Libya had drifted into being a bit of an unruly sultanate of the Ottoman Empire, and it was difficult for the Ottomans to fully govern them. And thus, criminal gangs who had access to sailing ships began commerce raiding. And in the case of the United States, they were not only commerce raiding, but they were conducting the impressment of sailors, which is where they basically take a sailor for ransom, take him back to Africa, to Tripoli or Benghazi or Sirte, and they held them. And they had done this with a lot of European ships. And so Thomas Jefferson, of course, begins the first punitive expedition in 1801 to go after the Barbary pirates, and this is where we get in the Marine hymn to the shores of Tripoli. Fast forward, the Ottoman Empire falls at the end of World War I, and Libya ends up in the hands of, or close to the during the World War I period, and Libya ends up falling into the hands of the Italians in a war against the Turks. We catch up again with Libya during the North Africa campaign against the Italians and the Nazis by the United States and the United Kingdom. And in 1943, it is captured by the Allies, and from 1943 to 1951, it is under Allied administration. During that time, America established an American air base called Wheelus Air Base, and that airfield is now an international airport and still stands to this day. And in 1951, achieving independence, the United Kingdom of Libya was born. Until 1969, it managed to rule itself, and then one of the political movements that was sweeping the Arab world was that of Baathism, if you will. I'm just going to put it in much more familiar terms to most people, and that is a wave of Arab nationalism that was based on socialism. It wasn't outright communist, but it held some of the tenets that we would associate with it, and we did. They never fully gave complete fealty to communist ideals, but some of the more nihilistic ideas about how to govern a population were indeed in this, and it was in Nasserism in Egypt, Baathism in Syria, eventually Baathism in Iraq. It was no mistake that in similar fashion, King Idris was overthrown by a coup d'etat organized by the army, much as in the case as it was in Egypt, right next door, led by Muammar Gaddafi. And that was where we got the Gaddafi regime beginning in 1969. Well, the air base that I told you about, Wheelus Air Base, the Libyans, they threw us out. We really didn't have much need for it anyway. And at a certain point, of course, the Soviets had the pleasure of landing their planes on our airstrip, and I'm sure it was all quite droll for them. But in the 1970s, Libya didn't want to cut off relations with the United States outright. There was an opening because uh, there was energy infrastructure that was in Libya that the United States wanted to keep a hand in, keep an eye on, where the United States opted for a much more ambiguous policy, which I won't get into, but one of the outgrowths of it, one of the noticeable outgrowths of it that'll dictate the history until 2003 for the most part, was that Libya became a breeding ground for international terrorist groups, revolutionary groups with a revolutionary flair, if you will. This included Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path in Latin America. There was representation by the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, today known as the FARC. The Irish Republican Army was there, as was Action Direct, a communist terrorism unit in France. Red Brigade in West Germany, as well as the Basque separatist group. It became a United Nations, if you will, for terrorism. Well, a gentleman named Edwin Wilson was assigned by the Central Intelligence Agency to keep an eye on Carlos the Jackal, the famous international terrorist who was residing there, and to make himself useful under the cover of working for an oil company conducting shipping, and penetrate as quickly and as efficiently as he could these terrorist units. And the Libyans seemed to look the other way on having Americans from the CIA there. And the idea was is that it would be a terrorism tracking scheme whereby you could recruit informants out of the attendees of the various camps. Unfortunately, we were arming these people to the teeth. At one point, Green Beret from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, were even asked to go over and teach these terrorists things like hand-to-hand combat, combat engineering skills, ambushes, so forth and so on. At this point, we are training terrorists. The Green Berets, to their credit, found out about it or found out what it is they were actually doing, and they gradually just lost interest and left. Well, the whole house of cards came to an end in 1980 when Frank Turple, who was attempting to arrange an arms deal to Africa, was apprehended in a sting operation in New York City by the NYPD, not the FBI or any other federal agency. It was the NYPD. And the entire operation went bust. Wilson ended up staying a little bit longer, but he was paranoid. The Libyans were suspicious of him, and he eventually decided, after the CIA sent a dangle to him, that he might try his luck in the Dominican Republic, where he was apprehended immediately upon landing in Santo Domingo and was transferred to New York. The following year, 1981, saw some hard times where the U.S. Navy, the Fifth Fleet, the USS Nimitz Battle Group was conducting drills in the Mediterranean Sea. Colonel Gaddafi had decided the entire Gulf of Sidra was his, and it was an extra maritime claim that he didn't actually have the right to those particular waters, and the Libyan Air Force began harassing U.S. Navy ships and aircraft in that time. And there was one day, August 19th, when the U.S. Navy sent two F-14s up with live ammunition, and they were conducting just air-to-air dogfighting drills. And when the Libyan Air Force came out to meet them, the F-14s defended, and they put up with about 5 separate feigned attacks by the Libyans before they were given the order to shoot them down. Over the ensuing 5 years, the U.S. Navy would continue to assert freedom of navigation of the Gulf of Sidra, and there were tensions here and there, but nothing spoiled into open view, until the Wilson Turple terror operation came back into full view when there was a bombing conducted by the West German Red Brigade at the Labelle discotheque in Berlin. U.S. service personnel were killed. It was definitively linked back to Gaddafi. And Operation El Dorado Canyon was launched on April 15, 1986. U.S. Navy jets from 2 aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, and I don't know why the Air Force was invited to fly F-111s the distance that they did, because frankly, 60 fighter bombers taking off from England makes a lot of noise and gives a lot of warning that you're going to be there in about 6 hours. Nevertheless, the Air Force had to come along, little brother. After El Dorado Canyon, it is believed that Gaddafi was personally stung because I believe a stepdaughter was in fact killed in the bombing. We don't hear from him again until an attack that was attributed to him on December 21st, 1988, when Pan Am Flight 103 from London to New York blew up over Lockerbie, Scotland. Fast forward yet again. By this point, the Cold War is over. Gaddafi is in the wilderness. Iraq and Afghanistan have already happened. Gaddafi began wondering if he was next. Well, Czekmate worked a little bit on this business of the Libyan disarmament and Libya opening up, so I've got to be a little careful what I say. I was a tertiary player. But what it basically amounts to is that very quiet diplomacy between the British and the United States took place for the disarmament of the Libyans, and it began to take place in late 2003. And to the satisfaction of an awful lot of hawkish people in Washington, D.C., Gaddafi really did give up everything he had. He seemed to have a change of heart and wanted to join the community of nations. This apparently did not set well with some people because the spoils of Gaddafi were a couple of things: stockpiled gold and energy in the form of oil and gas, primarily oil. Well, as we continue on, Barack Obama was elected with a radical shift in policy in the Middle East, and it is one where he envisioned a Middle East where the United States was no longer the pivot player, but a swing player, and that one of the two poles of the Middle East being either Turkey or Iran, and in the early going of his administration, it was Turkey, that they would be the hinge point of our strategy in the Middle East. Well, by this point, President Erdogan had been elevated. Libya had been an Ottoman possession. He was an Ottoman nostalgic. And of course, he began his 2009 Muslim Brotherhood apology tour. Shortly after that, the Arab Spring kicked off, and shortly after that, on February 17th, 2011, Libya and Tunisia faced revolts. Tunisia, relatively speaking, got theirs under control pretty quickly. Libya became a scene of chaos, and the United States began taking sides. When you look at the back and forth between the United States and Libya, as I write here in the bottom line, if you are a Libyan nationalist, can you think of a solid reason why you would trust the United States? I would argue self-interest is static the world over throughout humanity. No, you really couldn't. The Civil War continued to rage on. By October 20th, Gaddafi was executed. He was found in a drain pipe, and he was pulled out and got a round through the head. And then there was eventually a ceasefire, and in that ceasefire, there was a great deal of ammunition that had gone loose throughout the entire country of Libya, specifically man-portable air defense missiles. Now, there's some dispute how much was there and how much the U.S. had trafficked in. So, in Benghazi, which is right here where the laser pointer, faux laser pointer, is pointing, in Benghazi, it was established as a collection point, and the weapons would be shipped out of Benghazi, and ostensibly they would be destroyed, and in reality they were going to Turkey, which eventually they were going to Syria. And so we're basically buying back weapons that we had put there during the Civil War. You'll remember this famous scene where Hillary Clinton said, "We came, we saw, he died." She was exuberant, and she was sitting in the same room as Leslie Stahl, and the amount of sin that woman has to repent for, to my view, it is not my place to judge, but. During the Benghazi attack, it was relative peace. In certain places that you look in the web, they talk about active civil conflict and ceasefire. It's never really been at peace ever since it fell. But May 17th is when the Second Libyan Civil War is attributed to have started. And it was the following summer that we started seeing the mass migrations from the north coast of Libya, as well as Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq, into Europe and eventually on to the United States. Shortly before Donald Trump came to office, although it really didn't put a stop to it, his arrival, shortly before he came to office, the Libyan National Accord was established in Tunisia, in Tunis, the capital of Tunisia. This, generally speaking, and yes, this was pulled from Wikipedia because it was the best map that I could actually find on short notice, is generally how the lines have stabilized, and you'll see how that features in the Libyan national picture going forward. So now that we're current and you've got a short history on why it is you can't really trust the United States if you're a Libyan, who really can you trust? You've already been subject to the Ottomans, and the Turks are already back in Libya. Your history is that you've been subject to the Turks. The Italians have occupied you, and you have a feeling that they've robbed you blind before. Same thing with the French. Well, very intelligently, the Russians came in, and the wonderful thing about the Russians is that they don't have Foreign Corrupt Practices Act laws. So, Gazprom, remember these guys from a previous presentation? Gazprom establishes themselves as a major player primarily within the actual oil industry, even though Libya has natural gas reserves that are worth pursuing if you're an international broker. Oil is far more plentiful. But being a player that's putting down money in Libya is what the Russians were really about, because once again, natural gas, it's also a flanking position to Israel, albeit one country removed. And the Russians injected an organization called the Wagner Group. These folks are more ruthless than Blackwater USA was ever accused of. They are a private military company. They are the guarantor of Russian interests. They also take up sides in the fighting of the Civil War. The critical warlord who established relations with Russia is a man named Haftar. And you will see Khalifa Haftar, in fact. Khalifa Haftar remains actively engaged with the Russians. He remains actively engaged in civil fighting in Libya. He doesn't have as much of an interest in politics. That falls to his son. That falls to his son Saddam, and Saddam really just means confronter in Arabic, by the way. Saddam Haftar has now registered his interest in running for president of the country. So too has Saif Al Islam Gaddafi's son. Both of these have a solid relationship with the Russians. And the other big force presence in the country is Turkey. Turkey is there as a military force, drawing on their nostalgic Ottoman history. But more importantly, Turkey is an influencer of jihad organizations that are actively fighting in the Civil War. When Turkish-backed jihadis began losing in the past 3 years in Syria at the hands of the coalition and joint efforts with the Russians, Turkey deposited many of them in Libya to take up a side on Turkey's behalf. So these essentially, these foreign jihadists, and I misspelled jihadist here, please forgive me, these jihadists are actually Turkey's mercenaries. Russia has their mercenaries, and there's basically two sides. There's multiple sides in the conflict, but there's two sides of the political divide in terms of actual presidential material that can make a credible showing, not just in Libya, but on the world stage, that Russia is friendly with. And if Russia were to get the Turkish buy-in, you have the grist for a national unity government. So therein lies the hook back to Gog of Magog and Put. That at least is one hook of that coalition of the willing that I spoke of earlier. So the oil and gas, I'm not going to get too heavily into it. This is kind of a laydown of the petroleum infrastructure of Libya. The Russians are active here, kind of here, and in these areas here. In the red, this is natural gas. In the green, this is actual oil. As you can see, the place is practically floating on this stuff, and you can see why a lot of countries would have wanted in there. The Libyans are now, naturally and understandably, even though there are European interests engaged there, they've become rather hostile from 2011 onward. They've become rather hostile to what the interests are of Europe and the United States. So the overall context of Libya in all of this is that here they are, and the many peoples with you is likely those jihadi mercenaries that Turkey had evacuated from Syria, as well as some hotheads that are still operating here in Syria. In other words, it would be a jihadi uh, provisional army, if you will. We call them in the military provisional rifle units. These are just infantry that you pick up from here, there, and everywhere who actually know how to operate a rifle. And we call them in the Civil War context militia, or the revolutionary context militia. It would be the same deal. There would be provisional formations of troops that would come out of probably both places as the many people with you. Put, of course, is Libya. That's generally the biblical scholarship that I follow. And it is also, here is the big hook back to the other presentation. You talk about energy flows coming out of here, Russia's efforts in here, and the danger of Israeli energy here that could really undermine the Russian agenda in terms of meeting a peer relationship with the United Europe. This is the one other place in the Mediterranean basin where energy can be derived to take the pressure off of the European energy picture from Russia. And now we have Russia fully engaged here. It's quite natural that Putin, if he were to put together a coalition of the willing, would consolidate his political position and amity, if you will, between peoples by including them on some kind of operation against Israel with a view to putting a dent in what an energy powerhouse they have offshore. One other thing is the last video that I made, I had mentioned it in the context of Israel making great gains against Syria and Lebanon. That was but one possibility. I wanted to posit one other, is that with what is happening in this area up here, in the borders up here between Belarus and now Latvia and Lithuania are involved too, with migrants that want to overrun their perimeter, along with Russia's efforts in Ukraine, which I would argue is Putin's real main effort right now, incidentally, is I had mentioned the idea of him having to stop in order to go save his allies. There's one other thing that may happen, and that is he may achieve such success in this area here with after Afghanistan, NATO being in such disarray politically, he may achieve such breakthrough success here that he foolishly and pridefully decides he's going to go ahead and patiently assemble an army to invade. And it'll be done out of pride and not anger that he had to drop everything and come down here. Either way, we've come to the conclusion that it is likely going to happen. So that's it, nearly 30 minutes, and I am really and truly sorry. I'm sorry it meandered. I wish that I could have spoken more concisely for most of it, but I just came to a point to where I said I'm just going to get it done and punch this thing out. To follow upon a theme that I had been building upon over the past handful of videos here, I wanted to draw this to your attention. This is toward the closing of Ezekiel 39. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, now I will restore the fortunes of Jacob and have mercy on the whole house of Israel. If you remember 2 videos ago, I was addressing the issue of an Israel that was internally divided for very ancient reasons. The whole of Israel, and I will be jealous for my holy name. They shall forget their shame and all the treachery they practiced against me, when they dwell securely in their land with none to make them afraid. It goes on, of course. And I truly do recommend reading Ezekiel 38 and 39 for yourselves. It may very well speak to you. I think that the Lord wants people to understand that this is happening around him. So when you decide that you want to delve back into this book, ask him for knowledge, ask him for eyes to see, And with that, I bid you good night. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.